Good morning. Good to see everybody. This morning we will try to use this as your regular Bible study time. So any questions that may be asked, probably not rhetorical. You're welcome to answer those questions and make comments if you have them. Either shout it out or I'll try to look back and forth to see a hand go up if you have anything that you want to add to it. Appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'll save some of the introduction for the series and for the week till this morning after Bible study, but I'm certainly honored to be here. I guess I've got all week. If Brian wants to talk bad about me, I guess I've got all week to get in my shots too, but it's very smart of him to not invite somebody that's better than he is. My job by the end of the week, which a good friend of mine has always said, when you go to a gospel meeting, your job, and I did one there, and he said, your job is to make me look good by the end of the week. And so hopefully by the end of the week, you'll say, boy, are we lucky to have Brian. And just like I hear all the time from the folks at Moundsville, boy, we wish we had Brian back. But I'll do my best this week, and hopefully it will be an enjoyable week, and we'll all learn something and have something to take away from the week. I didn't know how big, I guess, to make things. Ours is small at home, kind of a little smaller, and it's set to the 4x3. It's not a widescreen yet, and so I didn't know exactly. So hopefully it's not too small. And throughout the week, Monday through Friday, there'll be handouts that you can follow along with as well. So hopefully that will supplement for it. We're going to talk for just a while this morning and about Pilate's question. And this lesson is a series that I do in some gospel meetings and have done in the past called Standing Beneath the Cross. And the whole series kind of goes through the scene on the cross, and we just imagine ourselves being there and being part of the crowd and part of the mob, and just kind of putting ourselves in different positions and just imagine ourselves standing beneath the cross of Jesus and all the things that were going on around at that time. And this is actually the first lesson in that series, but I use it oftentimes to do a Bible study at the beginning of a gospel meeting or the beginning of any series of lessons that we're going to do. This week will be a Bible study. I'll get my clicker to work. So we're going to start this VBS this week, and I do always like to start with something that's going to refresh our minds maybe about why we're here. What are we doing here? And so I think Pilate's question does that very well. What then shall I do with Jesus? It's a good question, right? And it's a question that we're going to try to answer this week. What shall I do with Jesus? And so we're going to address that question this morning. And again, make it something personal, which we'll look at in just a moment, that I need to answer that question. What shall I do? Pilate has already answered that question. I need to answer that question. What am I going to do with Jesus? And as we look through the series of lessons, we understood that we can't change anything that happened at the cross, right? We're just there as spectators standing beneath the cross. We're not going to change Pilate's mind. As we're standing beneath the cross, we're not going to change Pilate's mind about the decision that he made. But what we're trying to do is what decision am I going to make? Can I make a better decision than Pilate did? And I think sometimes we try to make the same decision that Pilate made. And again, we'll look at that in just a moment. So what then shall I do with Jesus? The question is very personal. And if you look at the situation that Pilate's in, I think that this is a question that he would much rather avoid than to answer, which is what he tries to do. But understand, just like with everything that came to Pilate, the final decision was going to be his. This was not a decision that he was going to be able to let somebody else make. It was his decision. That's why Jesus is standing before him as we're looking at it right now. And if you want to open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 27, Matthew chapter 27, this is the scene that we're talking about. Now it starts in verse 19, but I just want to call your attention to verse 22 of Matthew chapter 27. Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" And they all said, "Crucify him." And even though this is what the mob is telling Pilate to do, understand that the decision is his to make. He is going to decide whether or not Jesus lives or dies. The final decision is his. He could absolutely say, "We're letting this guy go. He's done nothing. We're letting this guy go. You guys need to calm down. You guys need to go away." That's something that he could have done. Now he knows and he sees that this riot is developing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in more detail later. But I understand that they're trying to coerce him to make a certain decision. But the final decision is his. We're going to go through peer pressure. There's going to be people that are going to tell us certain things and want us to do certain things. But understand that our reaction to things is our own decision. That we are going to decide what we are going to do with Jesus. So let's take a look for just a while at what the factors were. When we make a decision, we tend to gather a lot of information. So this doesn't always work if you only have one child. But if you've got more than one, this is probably what we do most times as parents, right? We're information gatherers, right? So child number 1 comes and says, child number 2 did this. And so child number 3 comes and says, no, that's not what happened, right? Because child number 3 has already picked a side too. And so what we do as parents is we say, okay, let's get all the information. You tell me what you think happened. You tell me what you think happened. You tell me what you saw. And then I'll make a decision about who needs spanked right now, right? I'll make the decision on what needs to be done from this point. But we gather all the information. And so let's do that with Pilate. Pilate's trying to gather information to decide what decision he's going to make. So let's take a look. I can turn around and make sure these things are going. Let's look at the 2 prisoners that we have here. So turn with me to Mark, and I won't do this all week, but I do have the verses up here. And I don't typically do that, but because it's a Bible study and I need to get through a certain amount of information, I've thrown it up there. In Mark chapter 15, starting in verse 6, let's take a look at the 2 prisoners that we have. And then we'll look at 1 Peter. But he says, now at the feast, he used to release for them any one prisoner whom they requested. And the man named Barabbas had been in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the insurrection. And the multitude went up and began asking him to do as they had been accustomed to do for them. Pilate answered them, saying, do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he was aware the chief priests had delivered him up because of envy. The chief priests stirred up the multitude to ask to release to them Barabbas instead. So as we look through and look at this man Barabbas, I want us to understand, and sometimes because we're reading the Bible and we don't know a lot about history, a lot about the Jewish customs and even Roman customs, we sometimes lose the fact that these were not the only 2 prisoners in the prison system at that time, right? It wasn't that he got the only 2 people in the prison system to come out and say, okay, well, which one? We have 2 prisoners here. Which one do you want me to release? There's a lot of people he can choose from. I believe that he chose Barabbas for a reason. We notice that he talks about this murderer, somebody that committed murder in the insurrection. Listen, the Jews didn't like the fact that the Romans were controlling a lot of what they did. Okay, so there were people that wanted to fight against that and to resist against that. So now, again, the Romans, in some of their wisdom, allowed the Jews a lot of leeway, to continue to do things in the way that they had always done them. They changed a few things, but for the most part, they allowed them to continue with their religious practices, right? And even some of their non-religious practices. They allowed them to do those things. But a lot of these people, some of these insurrectionists, didn't like that. They didn't like that Rome had control over certain things that they did. And so some of these people, would go and kind of fight back, almost like terrorists, right? These people were considered at that time to be terrorists because they're fighting against the Roman government. Now, what would happen when they did this? The Romans would come back on the Jewish people and make it even harder for them. And so, while this Barabbas may not, like it, it may look like on the surface, here's somebody that's fighting for the Jews, right? No, they didn't want this guy out. They would not have, in any other circumstance, chosen to put this guy back into the multitude so that he could do something else and make their lives harder when the Romans came down on them. They didn't want that. So it's not that he's setting out two people and saying, I'm sure that you want Barabbas instead of Jesus to be released. I truly believe with all my heart that Pilate's thinking in his mind, they certainly don't want this murderer, this insurrectionist back out in the crowd. So they'll drop everything and let Jesus go. So this is person number one. Now, we know a lot about Jesus already, but I think 1 Peter describes him pretty well. 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 21. He says, "For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps." Well, what is that example? "Who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threat, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously." Doesn't that look like an easy decision to make? This is part of the information that Pilate is gathering. It looks like it should be an easy decision to make, doesn't it? I think all of us would say, yeah, that's a pretty easy decision. I think we would let Jesus go. But that's obviously not what happened. Now, I want you to look at something else. Look at Matthew chapter 27. So we know the two people that we have to choose from, and the answer, again, is obvious to us, and it should be obvious to Pilate. It probably was obvious to Pilate. But let's take a look at what Pilate's own wife told him. So we look at Matthew chapter 27 and verse 19. "And while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, 'Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him.'" Okay, so what's the big deal? Well, let me ask you, men. Have you ever not taken your wife's advice and then she ended up being right? Is that really something that we want to go through? Is that really something that we want to talk about? I told you to turn left. I knew that it needed to go left, but you thought we had to go right. Right? Here's his wife that's telling him, have nothing to do with this righteous man. And so while he's, gathering all of this information and trying to figure out what decision he's going to make, even his wife is saying, let him go. Don't have anything to do with him. Just let him go. She's going to turn out to be right. Go ahead.
We have instances where God has appeared, or his angels has appeared to people in dreams. Now, a woman believes Christ to be a righteous man, and obviously Pilate does too.
Mm-hmm.
Pilate didn't have any dream, so obviously God didn't appear to him, realizing he didn't want the events changed.
Right.
But do you feel that God actually appeared to his wife in a dream, or did she just have just a normal dream?
I don't know. I don't know that I could say one way or the other. I feel like it was probably because of the situation. God has a hand in it. But I don't know that for sure. But honestly, I think, that's a tough thing to try to figure out sometimes is we know that Jesus has to be crucified. But Pilate doesn't have to make that decision. Pilate's decision is his own. He can make the decision one way or the other. And I believe that God is giving him all of the evidence to say, this is a righteous man. Let him go. But he's not going to make that decision. And again, we know that God knows that, but yet He's giving him all of the information that he needs. And again, I don't know one way or the other whether this was God coming to her in a dream, or if this is just something that's been on her mind and she's been thinking about it and she sees it, and so she's had this dream and she's suggesting to him or not.
I know most of the commentaries think God
Yeah.
appeared to him and
Yeah.
appeared to her in a dream, but I fail to see,
And usually it is told.
God's position, but the advantage that would come from appearing to her in a dream.
Yeah.
I just feel that it was just a normal dream.
And it very well could be. And typically he will tell us. It will specify God came to this person in a dream, or God came to that person in a dream. So, again, I don't know. Brian, do you know? Okay. But that's good. That's a good comment to look at, something to think about. All right, so last thing we're going to look at as far as the information, and there's more, but the last thing that we're going to look at as far as what was going on into the information that he was gathering was really his own judgment. Now, this is what he does. Okay, this is what he does for a living. This is not something that this is the first thing that he's going to have to make a decision about. Again, same thing we talked about with parents. The first time, this isn't the first time. When my kids come to me today, and they'll probably be something that we've got to deal with today. When they come to me today, it's not going to be the first time that I say, go ask your mother. Right? It's not going to be the first time that something happens where they come to me and this is what we do. These are decisions that we make all the time. This is this man's job, to make these kind of decisions, these kinds of judgments. Right? This is what he does for a living. Notice what he himself is looking at here in these verses. Luke chapter 23, starting in verse 13. And Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers of the people, and said to them, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion, and behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. Nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us. And behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish him and release him. Now, interesting last statement there, right? So he goes through and he says, you brought this person accusing him of these things, but I've examined him. I've found no guilt in him. No guilt. No, according to the charges that you've made against him, he hasn't done anything. Herod didn't find anything. That's why he sent him back to us. Nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore punish him. Now, again, imagine that as parents. All right, I'm looking at it, and it looks like nobody did anything, so I'm going to spank all three of you and send you off on your way. That's what Pilate is doing, right? That's what he's suggesting. He hasn't done anything wrong. I'll beat him and then set him free. Why? Why not just set him free? Again, he's trying to appease the crowd in any way that he can to keep Jesus alive. And again, you maybe applaud him for that, for trying. And so he's going to beat him, and then he's going to end up on the cross anyway. But this is his own judgment. He hasn't done anything. So I'll punish him and then let him go. This is the decision that Pilate wants to make. We have all of this information that we can look at as far as what he's doing. 2 prisoners. It's easy. It's an easy decision. His wife being nervous about it. Easy decision. Right? His own judgment says, let the guy go. But what does he end up doing? I'll just say that it doesn't matter what Pilate ended up doing. Because that's not what we're here to talk about. What we're here to talk about is, what will you do? That's the question that we need to ask. It was personal to Pilate. It's personal to you. Look at Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. And we'll start in verse 12 or read verse 12. It says, "So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not in my presence only, but now much more in my absence," he says, "work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." Now, the context is speaking of the wicked world in which we live in and our responsibility as children of God in that world to be light and to be salt. And again, what is light? What is salt? What's he talking about? And I always say it like this. He tells us not to be a clanging cymbal, right? Noise. What happens when you hear noise? Well, your attention goes to that noise. What was that noise? You go looking for that noise. What happens when you turn a light on? Do you look at the light? Does your attention go to the light? No. It goes to everything that light illuminates, right? That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to reflect Christ's light so that other people don't see us, but they see Christ living in us. He tells us to be salt. Right? Now, I know people that, and Lana's grandma is one of those people, that salt is almost a meal to her. Right? She eats a lot of salt. I've seen her open a bag of salt and vinegar potato chips and salt them. That's a lot of salt. Okay? But salt is not meant to be the meal. It's meant to enhance what you're eating, right? So, we're not meant to be the steak. Christ is the steak. But sometimes people aren't going to take Christ the way He is. Because you're going to have to use a little salt. Don't change it. But you're going to have to use a little salt. Make it palatable. Make it something that they can see and look at and make, their own decisions. You're not going to force them into it. Be salt, be light. You're not the thing, but you're supposed to lead people to the thing. And that's what we're meant to do. And so that's the context in which we're talking about here. And he says, work out your own salvation. You're going to do this. You have to do this. You have to make these decisions. And so no matter what, where we are in our life, we are going to have to make that decision. What are we going to do with Jesus? We have Jesus. We know Jesus. We know He's here. But what are you going to do with Him? This week, we're going to be learning about Jesus. What are we going to do with Him? Romans chapter 6. If you look there with me. Romans chapter 6 and verse 3. It says, "Or do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus have been baptized into His death?" Or do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ? Each individual person has made that decision to be baptized into Christ. Therefore, having and partaking in His death in that way. Again, like we've talked about with Pilate all this time, the choice is yours, and it's yours alone. Now, there are other factors, right? We know that there are other influences that are going to lead us one way or the other. And we'll talk about some of those things this week, especially on Monday and Tuesday, and even tonight in the lesson tonight. But the decision is ours as to what we're going to do with it. No one can stop us. No one can stand in our way except for us. We can stand in our own way. We need to weigh the facts and make the decision. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33, evil communications corrupt good morals. Every time. We need to be careful about that and what we're allowing as influence in our life. So let's look at a little bit more of this. So the question is personal in the sense of what shall I? What do you want me to? And then it demands action in that, what do you want me to do? What shall I do with Jesus? So Pilate is going to try to escape this as best he can. If you look at Matthew chapter 27 and verse 24, it says, "And when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the multitude, saying, 'I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves.'" Right? Dads, does this sound familiar? Happy Father's Day to all of you that I'm throwing under the bus right now, by the way. Does it sound familiar? This is, in essence, Pilate saying, go ask your mother. I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to answer this question. Go ask Mom. And that's what he's doing. He's washing his hands and saying, I don't want to have anything to do with this decision. You do it. You deal with it. You take care of it yourself. Well, the bad news, I guess, that we have to tell Pilate is that the inaction that he takes is going to condemn an innocent man to death. There's go ahead.
I got to thinking, when we have been in the crowd that was causing all the commotion, everybody said, no, I wouldn't be in that crowd, but would we?
Yeah, and again, I think there are times that we are in that crowd. We're not standing there, it's not physical, but we're standing there. We're standing right there with them. We might not be shouting crucify, but we're not telling them not to. And again, there's action that's required on our part. If we are standing there, are we speaking for him? Speaking against him? We're not doing anything, which I think a lot of times is what we do. We try to sit on the sidelines and not do anything. But his inaction is going to condemn Jesus to death. There's a story of a young man who's playing basketball, and I use a lot of sports analogies. I'll try not to use too many of them this week, but there's a story of a young man whose time is running down. Coach set up a play, and the kid catches the ball where he's supposed to catch the ball, holds on to it until the clock runs out. And so after the game, after they lose, coach calls him over and says, "Why didn't you take the shot?" Well, I didn't want to miss. I didn't want to miss, so I didn't shoot. Well, his inaction also cost them the game. Give it a chance. Give it a chance to go into the basket. You have to shoot it. By standing there holding it, you have made a decision. And again, that's what Pilate is doing. He's trying to wash his hands and say, I'm innocent of this man's blood. But guilt and innocence is not going to be up to him. That's going to be up to God. And because his son was put to death for that, I wouldn't want to be the one to wash my hands up. And again, we're not standing there, but are we standing there? It's a good question to think about. So this week, as we're talking about these things, we're going to do these things. We're either going to accept, we're going to receive, or we're going to reject. We're going to obey, we're going to disobey. We're going to confess, we're going to deny Christ as we're here this week. And we're each going to have to make that decision. Matthew chapter 12 and verse 30. He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters. That's Jesus' idea on whether or not we're for him or against him. Are you helping? If you're not helping, you're scattering. I remember as a kid, we would go berry picking. And I used to love to go berry picking. And Mom would give us the little baskets that we could pick the berries and put them in. And Mom would always make desserts out of them when we got back home. Mine was never quite as full as everybody else's when we got home. I wonder why. 1 for me, 2 for me, 3 for me. Okay, 1 in the basket, right? And we probably are all in some ways like that. I want to get mine first, and then if there's anything left, I'll. And Jesus says, if you're not helping, you're scattering. You might as well be taking what we've already gathered and dumping it for somebody else to pick up. And so it's one way or the other. We're either doing or we're not. Now, again, the question is for us. What do you say? What do you do? So look at Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 13. Something that he asks of his disciples here. Now, when Jesus came to the district of Caesarea Philippi, he began asking his disciples, saying, who do people say that the Son of Man is? So, who do other people say that I am? Well, they go through the list, right? Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, others still Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And it's almost like Jesus says, okay, now I don't care what other people think. I don't care what other people think or who other people think that I am. He asked them the question, who do you say that I am? The people closest to me, the people who are following me, the people who are my disciples, who do you tell people? Who do you say that I am? It's almost like when somebody asks you, who do you say that I am? When somebody asks you the same question that I just asked you, who do other people say that I am? When somebody comes to you and says, who is Jesus? Who do you say that I am? And again, Simon Peter gives the right answer. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he goes on to tell him, upon this confession, I will build my church on it. I am the Son of God. What are we going to do with that question? Again, it's not just about saying, it's not just about verbalizing it. What are we going to do with it? And be careful, because inaction means denial. Just like with Pilate. If we do nothing, that means we're denying Christ. Even though we may say, no, I know that He's God's Son. If we do nothing, we're denying Christ. We can say it over and over. And again, I believe that confessing Christ is more than saying the words. It's living the life. It's doing the things that God has asked us to do. It's more than just, are the words important? Yes. I'm not trying to take away from them. The words are important. We do need to confess with our mouth. We also need to confess through our actions. And again, I think that's part of what He's trying to get to His disciples there in Matthew chapter 16. Who do you say? Who do you tell people that I am? The last thing that we're going to look at this morning, and I'll try to go through it quickly, is the question is about someone specific, right? It's personal, it requires action, and it is about Jesus. Every other decision that Pilate has made. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Pilate from history or even from Bible, but there are a few Christian and Jewish historians. Josephus mentions him a few times that talk about Pilate. And one of the things that they say about Pilate, from the small history that we do know about him, is that he was a very hard judge. A decision like this usually didn't take him very long. He wasn't one that was reluctant to have people put to death, is all I'm trying to say. He's reluctant here, but that wasn't his norm. There was something different about this man that was put before him that day. You know, history tells us that he didn't have an issue, or he didn't have a problem making decisions, putting people to death. He's having issue here today. Now, he eventually, again, through his inaction, puts him to death. But he's having a tough time with this decision. Usually he doesn't. He's okay saying, put him to death, crucify him. That's, he's not, somebody that takes a moral stance. That's what I'm trying to say. And so, all of the other decisions that Pilate has made is dwarfed by this one. And he knows it. Again, from what we know of secular history, biblical history, he knows it. You can feel it. You can read it in the Scriptures that he's having trouble with this one. And again, the decisions that we make about Jesus are going to be the most important ones. Now, all of the things that I'm about to mention can include Jesus, right? So when we're trying to decide what school we're going to go to, in college especially, we're trying to decide that. Is Jesus factored in? I know a lot of people who didn't factor Jesus in. And they didn't make it through their college life as a Christian. We'll talk more about that later in the week, even tonight. So, are we factoring Jesus in that decision? When we are trying to decide what career we're going to have, when we do go to school, pick that school. Are we trying to decide when we're picking a career, is this going to allow me to be the best Christian that I can be? I'm not saying all of you have to be preachers. Not what I'm saying at all. But when we're trying to decide what career path we're going to choose, are we saying, you know what, I don't care about Jesus, I don't care about the church, I'm going to find my career and then I'll work around it? Or are we saying, you know what, this career might not be the best if I'm going to be a child of God? Are we factoring Him in that decision? when we're trying to decide who we're going to marry, are we factoring in Jesus? I'm not saying you always have to marry a Christian. But are we factoring that in? Is the person that I'm going to marry, are they going to help me be a child of God? Because if they're not helping, they're probably scattering. And again, I'm not saying you always have to marry a Christian. I'm just saying, did you factor it in when you're making that decision? Because it is an important one. All of the things that we're talking about, are we going to have kids? How many kids are we going to have? All of these decisions are external decisions. But they can all, hopefully, have Jesus in them. Look at Romans chapter 12 in the first 2 verses there. Romans chapter 12. It says, I urge you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good, acceptable, and perfect. I believe, and I say this often, I believe that people, most of the time, if somebody came in here and threatened all of our lives and said, deny Jesus or I'll kill you, I think all of us, or most of us, would say, I'm not denying. But how many of us live for Him? Why we have the opportunity to live. We would die for Him. But we need to be living for Him. It's that important that every decision that we make needs to run through that. What shall I do with Jesus? I look forward to the rest of the week. I hope you enjoyed Bible class this morning. Believe it or not, I was close. I almost got all the way